We are very honored to have Professor Long with us this morning to talk about his career, his military experience, and then also we'll dive into military history. Professor Long teaches a class on World War II, the Normandy each summer. So this is going to be a great thrill. So thank you so much, Professor Long, for joining us. We'll begin first, however, with a short bio of Professor Tom Long. So Professor Long is a member of the Department of History at George Washington University. Professor Long has a bachelor's from Dartmouth College and a JD from Harvard University Law School, and later earned his doctorate in history from George Washington University. Professor Long's research interests include colonial revolutionary America, the early modern world and military history, and Professor Long also teaches a series of military history courses and also a famous course at GW on Normandy during World War II. Professor Long is a U.S. Navy veteran. He served in the mid-1960s and later went to Harvard Law School after his experience in the Navy, and then after Harvard Law School was in corporate law for about 2 decades before coming to GW for his doctorate to work on his doctorate in history, which he earned in 2005, and he's been a member of the faculty, I guess, pretty much ever since. So welcome, Professor Long. I'm going to turn it over to you now. Over to you to talk about military.
Andy, thanks very much. Well, it's a privilege and an honor to be here. Thank you for doing this series. I think it's really an important thing to be doing. My military background is kind of screwy. I mean, I grew up in Colorado, but was always fascinated by the Navy, and I think that's attributable to a favorite uncle, Smitty, who was a chief pharmacist mate during the Second World War. He was with the Seabees, and with the group of Seabees that landed on Guadalcanal and built Henderson Field. And my aunt, his wife, and my cousin lived in our basement while he was off during the war, and I was tiny at that time. But when he came back, I heard stories from him. And I was fascinated by his stories about the Navy. I kind of grew up thinking I'd go to the Naval Academy, and I always wanted to be in the Navy. I could count to 12 without taking my shoes off. And so in 1957, when the Soviets, now the Russians, put up Sputnik, if you didn't do math or hard science, you were somehow unpatriotic. And I got stuck in, I was in junior high then, and I got stuck in an accelerated math and science program in high school, which turned out to be really fun and fascinating. It was a wonderful program. We don't have time to get all into that, but they picked students from my entire county, and we met once a week with a guest speaker. So we had George Gamov come and talk about cosmology, and had amazing speakers, and as a consequence of that, I was interested in math. When I applied to colleges, that cousin, who was then teaching math in my school system, having gotten out of the Air Force at that point, said, I know you've always wanted to go to the Naval Academy, but you could get the same commission, or almost the same. He thought it was the same, but it's not really. If you do NROTC at Dartmouth, and Dartmouth has the best math department in the country and is the last purely academic community left in the United States. And utterly coincidentally, and he to this day swears it is coincidental, and he's 8 years older than I am, which makes him older than dirt, that it was a coincidence, but the alumni from Dartmouth got a hold of me and invited me to a recruiting function. And in those days, Colorado ranked 7th among states in population at Dartmouth. You can ski there. So it was popular. And so I went to Dartmouth and was a math major. There were 2 versions of NROTC in those days. There was the contract program and the scholarship program. And I didn't apply for the scholarship program. I had a scholarship from Dartmouth for math. And so I was a contract NROTC, which meant that I had a 2-year commitment to serve after I graduated. that was, I mean, it never occurred to me not to go into the military. When Sputnik went up, it's hard to describe the impact it had on this country. Everybody figured that we have the Atlantic and the Pacific between us and anybody that's going to do us any harm. We didn't really worry a lot about Canada and Mexico, and everything was safe. When Sputnik went up, that bubble was burst, and all of a sudden the Cold War became very real, and people worried about us being in a real war with the Soviet Union at any point, and China kind of emerged into that somewhere along the way, and it just everybody who could thought they ought to be in the military. That was your duty as an American citizen to help defend the country, and so my Dartmouth class had, I think, 600 people in it. We commissioned 230 people into the three services, four if you count a handful of Marines. There were 36 got Navy commissions out of my class, out of one college. That's more than we commission out of our unit each year from the entire Washington, D.C. area now. It was a completely different world. And I really made really good friends in the unit. They're still good friends of mine. And I was very excited. And I really planned to stay in the Navy as a career. My first active duty station, I got sent to a couple schools. I got again, I could count. So the Navy sent me to a guided missile school and a nuclear weapons school, both down in Norfolk, and then sent me to the USS Springfield, which was the flagship of the U.S. Sixth Fleet at the time. I was what today would be called a surface warfare officer. There was no such thing in those days. There were line officers and corps officers, and if you weren't a doctor or supply or whatever, you were a line officer. And so I stood bridge watches on the USS Springfield. Probably the best home port the U.S. Navy has ever had. We were home ported in a town called Villefranche-sur-Mer, about halfway between Nice and Monte Carlo on the French Riviera. There had been a U.S. Navy ship home ported in Villefranche since 1815. And there was one, we were the last one there because de Gaulle withdrew from NATO and kicked all of us out, and so the Sixth Fleet flag moved from Villefranche to Gaeta, Italy, and that was the last time we had a ship based there. But our mission was to keep an eye on the Russian Mediterranean Squadron. They were building a base in North Africa, and they had a large force that operated in the Mediterranean, coming down from the Black Sea, and so we would kind of play tag with them. But being the flagship, we also had certainly a quasi-diplomatic mission as well. And we visited ports from Casablanca and Lisbon on the west to Beirut on the east. And we'd pull in, Sixth Fleet flag in those days was a 3-star. And whenever we'd pull in, we carried a helicopter on the ship, and they'd fly somebody out from the consulate or the embassy, and they'd give us a briefing on the diplomatic situation in the port that we were headed into, in the wardroom. And so we always had a pretty good handle on what circumstances were. It was fascinating. We went into Tangier just after the Ben Barka affair, and so we were attuned to that. We'd go into Athens and spend 3 days, and then we would hustle directly from Athens to Istanbul, and we'd stay 3 days. The next time we made an eastern swing, we'd go to Istanbul first, and we'd stay 4 days, and then we'd have to hurry to Athens and stay 4 days, because you couldn't stay longer in Athens than you did in Istanbul, and you had to kind of flip-flop them as to which ones went first. But as a consequence of that, I had always loved history, and I had, as part of Navy ROTC, we did a naval history course, which we still do in the NROTC program, and we used earlier editions of some of the materials they still do, and so I'd been fascinated with naval history since I was a kid, and being on the Springfield was like being in a living lab. The man who was the commanding officer in those days, my CO, was named John D.H. Kane, Jr. He retired after that and became director of the Navy, what was then called the Navy Historical Center. It's now the Navy History and Heritage Command down in the Navy Yard, and he ran the History Command for several years after that. But I had the bridge watch taking the ship up through the Dardanelles to Istanbul on one occasion. First time we had done it when I was aboard, and Kane went out and got in his captain's chair on the wing of the bridge and got the 1MC mic and proceeded to narrate the history, not the lore of the Trojan War, and told all the sailors to come out and look at what we were passing on the eastern bank as we went up. Then when we went down, he did the same thing, and he narrated the history of the Gallipoli campaign from the First World War as we sailed past Gallipoli. That morning, I had the watch coming out. We went out on a 48, and later we were sailing east in the Med, headed for Beirut, and had received word that the Russian Med Squadron was at anchor in a shallow point in the Med off the coast of Turkey. And the intelligence folks decided, and we lived on the 04 level. The flag bridge was the 03 level, one deck below us. And they decided they wanted to get a good look at the Russian Med Squadron, and so we received orders to sail through the middle of their anchorage at flank speed. And Springfield was built in 1943. It had been rehabbed to put guided missiles on. They took one turret off forward, one 6-inch turret forward, and one aft, and put a missile house on. And so cranked it up, and we were doing pretty close to 30 knots. The fantail was just thumping. I think every rivet in the ship was likely to come out. Sailed through the middle of the Russian Med Squadron, did a 180 and circled all the way around them. And they mounted movie cameras on all the directors. And so they were tracking the Russian ships, taking movies, not video. There was no such thing as video. Taking film of the Russian Med Squadron, and we did a 180 around them and sailed off to Beirut. Fascinating. They did not have the technology or the capability, seamanship, of doing underway replenishments. And so when their ships needed fuel and supplies, they would find a shallow spot in the Med and anchor, and they would run boats back and forth between the supply ships and the warships. And so we were able to kind of watch that up close. Mercifully, nobody shot at me my entire career, which was lucky. I have a good friend from the NRTC unit who's on the Vietnam Wall. He didn't have the same experience. There are 5 members of our class on that wall, but Steve was one of the first to die in Vietnam, and went over on his first tour. That said, I jumping from a boat to a landing in the south of France, not our home port, but another town, and I had on my suit because I had a date that night with a blind date arranged by one of my friends from the wardroom with Princess Grace's social secretary, and we were going to go hear Beethoven's Third Symphony in Monte Carlo. And so I had on my only suit, and we couldn't get close enough to the dock to step over to the pier. And the pier there in Beaulieu-sur-Mer was a series of old stone steps that descended into the water that were hundreds of years old, and so had been water washed for a long time, and they were all ripply. And so I jumped from the U-boat to the steps, and as soon as I landed, I heard this snap, and I proceeded to fall over, and I looked up at the beach guard officer and I said, "God damn it, I broke my leg." And I did. I did a double compound fracture on my lower left leg, tibia and fibula. He proceeded to go around behind the beach guard tent and get sick, and the corpsman and I managed to straighten the leg out, and they put me in a Stokes litter and took me over to a hospital. Our Sixth Fleet medical officer, who was a Navy captain, was a pediatrician, which wasn't a whole lot of help on the ship, but he did have good contacts, and he managed to find an orthopedic surgeon who came over and operated on my leg the next morning. I never made the date, and as it turns out, he was one of the premier orthopedic surgeons in the world. Um, and he had hoped he cut 3 inches out of the fibula and spliced the tibia back together with plates on each side of it, and wanted me to stay off of it for 2 weeks and then start to walk on it. Well, that's a procedure they would use now. Um, I stayed in the British American Hospital for a couple of weeks, and then was shipped. They strapped me back on a stretcher and put me on an aircraft and flew me up to the Army Hospital at Landstuhl. And as soon as I got there, the Army doctors looked at it and said, "Your leg's got to be in a cast." And I said, "Wait a minute." Dr. DeCamp didn't want it in a cast, and they said, "Well, you can't trust those guys." And so they put it in a cast from my toe to my hip, and I was then in casts for 9 months. And in those days, the Navy wasn't going to let me go back to sea on anything, much less a swift boat, which is one of my roommates from the Springfield had discovered that swift boats were a thing, and so he and I both asked for command of swift boat as our next duty station. Well, he went, and I went to Landstuhl for a while, and then to Bethesda, and the people at Bethesda also thought the leg should be in a cast, and it was in a cast for 9 months, and they weren't going to let me go back to sea. My duty station was the hospital. At that point, my mom had an apartment up on Connecticut Avenue, and they let me go stay in her spare bedroom. So I did that, and I just had to show up at Bethesda every other week, so they could thump on my cast and make sure it was intact and replace it when it needed to be. And I learned that Captain Kane had been transferred back from the Springfield to Beaupers, and so he was working over in the Pentagon. And I went over and said, "I'm going crazy. Give me a job." And so he assigned me to under the table to the casualty branch, and this was in 1966. When Vietnam was just really getting heated up, and we still weren't very good at dealing with casualties yet. We got better as the next couple of years went on, and I spent 3 or 4 months doing that. And I'd go over to the hospital Thursday morning, and they'd dump on my cast and say it's okay, and go away. And then I mentioned something about having to get to the office, and they said, "What do you mean the office?" And I said, "Well, I'm working over in the casualty branch at the Pentagon." And they said, "You can't do that. Your duty station is the hospital. If you continue to do that, we'll put you back in a bed, and you'll stay in the hospital permanently." And so I went over and I told Commander Pearson, who was my CO there, and Captain Kane, what they'd said, and they said, "Well, okay, sorry, you can't come over here anymore." And so starting with that. I didn't really care what else I did as long as I didn't do anything for the Navy. And one of my college roommates who had been Army ROTC, father was a company commander in the Second World War. Actually, was a glider parachute officer in the Second World War. His grandfather had been an infantry officer. And so Weaver was at UVA Law School, and so I'd go down to Charlottesville and tramp around campus down there with him and sit in on his law school classes. My mother was a lawyer. My dad worked for IBM. I'm named for Thomas Watson Sr., who founded IBM. So math and law sort of were there. But Weaver was in classes down there, and so I spent a lot of time with him going to his classes, and concluded that if the Navy wasn't going to let me do something useful in the Navy, I was going to get out. And my idea of something useful was being a line officer afloat, not sitting at a desk. I was going to get out and go to law school. Weaver finished law school then right after I was down there, when I was going down there, and went to Vietnam as an infantry company commander, not a JAG officer, which I always thought was sort of cool. But as a consequence of that, because when he and a couple of my other friends had taken what today would be called the LSAT, one morning while we were at Dartmouth, I decided maybe I should do that too, because I was told that if my eyes weren't 20/20, I couldn't get commissioned. And they were sort of borderline. Sometimes they test 20/20 and sometimes they wouldn't. And so I thought maybe I should have a plan B. And if I wasn't going to get commissioned, I'd need something to do. And so I took the LSAT with them. And I have never been able to find my records. I don't know what I did, but I did really well on it. And so before we got commissioned, I applied to Harvard and to Stanford. And I grew up in Colorado. And so I had figured I had come east to college. I was going to go west to go to law school, I'd go to Stanford Law School. And then I got good news. I was told I could get commissioned, and so I wrote letters to both Harvard and Stanford, and I said I'm going to be on active duty with the Navy now. I may want to come back. I'd appreciate it if you'd retain my records on file so that I can reactivate it if I need to at some time in the future. And I got back a form letter from Stanford that said we don't do that. If we'd love to have you come back, but reapply. And I got back a handwritten letter from the dean of the Harvard Law School that said, don't worry about it. You don't need to reapply. If you want to come to Harvard, drop me a postcard. That ended the debate about where I would go to law school. That was Dean Irwin Griswold, who had been Solicitor General, argued more cases in the Supreme Court than anybody since Daniel Webster. And so when I finished my Navy hitch, which was in September, I guess August of 1967. I started Harvard Law School that fall. My wife and I got married in August in London, and we knew we were going to be in Cambridge. She'd been dated me and Weaver, my friend from UVA, when we were at Dartmouth, and so Susan and I had been friends for a long time, and started going out then when I had bought an MG to be delivered to Villefranche. And then when I got my leg broken, I asked them to please ship it to the States instead after they shipped me back. And so it was delivered up to Boston, and Weaver and I drove up. He came up from Charlottesville, and we drove my mom's automatic transmission Oldsmobile to Boston to pick up my MG, because I could drive the automatic with my left leg in a cast. Getting in the car was tricky, but I could use my right foot, and that's all I needed to operate the car. But I couldn't drive an MG with a manual transmission. And so the plan was to have Weaver drive the MG back to Washington for me, and I drive Mom's car home. And it turned out that the ship that was on had been delayed, and it wasn't going to arrive when we were supposed to. And Weaver said, well, why don't we call Bev and Susan and see if they want to go have a drink? And Bev has in the meantime married a third one of our roommates, and they're still married. And Susan had dated Weaver and me, and so Susan and I started going out then. That was February, and we got married in August. And her mom said, well, you guys can get married in Cambridge if you want to. And if you do, that's terrific. Have a nice wedding, or you can get married in London, which is where they were living. And we'll do a reception and stuff for you here. That didn't seem like a hard choice to us. And so we got married in London, and came back and started law school that fall, which was an interesting transition. Unlike today, in those days, virtually everybody in the class had been in school from kindergarten to law school. There was no such thing as a gap year at all. More than half of this year's entering class at Harvard has taken a year off between college and law school. And that was the only people who had not gone straight through were veterans. One of my Dartmouth NROTC friends was in the class, and Mark and I were still in the reserves, so we go to reserves together every Wednesday night. We had another friend who had been in the Marine Corps for 6 years and had started, and so our group of friends at Harvard were almost entirely veterans. Sort of a really eclectic group of vets from all kinds of backgrounds, but it was a very small community, and because most of the class had gone straight through, and that made law school interesting for us. We tended to have different work habits than most of the people that had gone straight through. I mean, when I was aboard the Springfield, I had signature authority over 40 nuclear warheads, and I was used to some responsibility. When I think about the responsibility we had for handling a 610-foot guided missile cruiser as a 20-something, and having I was second man on the signature list for the warheads, but I don't care. As a 20 3-year-old. Sends chills down my spine sitting here now. But there's no place else that I could have had that kind of responsibility at that age and developed that sort of sense of commitment. I played football and wrestled in high school, and so being on a team and working with the team was not new, but the Navy really was a different level of commitment to that. And watching the Russian cruisers in the Med was interesting, and like I said, nobody ever shot at me, which made me happy, but we never knew from one minute to the next when they might. And so arriving in Cambridge with that background, where you worry a lot about your exams and that sort of thing, the exams didn't seem like such a big deal to me, which I mean, they obviously were, but and everybody treated them very seriously. But they were not a matter of life and death, and you were kind of used to handling things that were much more serious than that on a day-to-day basis as a 20-year-old, and so I think it made law school much easier for me than it would have been had I gone straight through. Um, uh, so I was really very fortunate in that regard, in having had that experience and having the friends that I did, who were also veterans when I was there, and I I had never been. I was going to say I'd never been out of the country until I got into the Navy. I had the only time I'd ever been out of the country, until I went on my midshipman cruise, was when we would drive home to Denver from Dartmouth. We would cut across the southern tip of Canada, north of the Great Lakes, to avoid the lake effect snows in the winter. So we'd try to go into the lakes, go into the Canada out of Buffalo and avoid them, and then come back on the western side of the Great Lakes and head for Colorado. So I'd been in Canada, but that was about it. And in those days, you didn't even need a driver's license. You just drove down the road and you went into Canada. My midshipman cruise, I was lucky. I did well in my ROTC unit, and so then the Navy sort of assigned people based on where they stood in their ROTC units, and I was first in the class, and so my midshipman cruise was to go to the Western Pacific. Was supposed to join a carrier, the Bonhomme Richard, in the Philippines. So we flew out of San Francisco to Hawaii and Guam and the Philippines. Landing in Guam that morning was interesting. We'd been on the plane all night. And the plane landed, and we taxied down the runway, and we're taxiing past B-52s parked wingtip to wingtip, with AP air police standing between each pair of aircraft. I don't remember how long it was, but it was the entire length of the runway. I never saw that many bombers in one place in my life, and that kind of underscored the seriousness of the Cold War, and obviously those B-52s were then going to be used in Rolling Thunder in Vietnam too. But as it turned out, the Bonhomme Richard had bent a prop shaft and was out of commission, and so they flew us up to Japan. And I was aboard the Bennington, which was an old carrier, anti-submarine carrier. So I spent the summer in Japan aboard the carrier, so traveling around Japan. And the captain of the Bennington attitude about the midshipmen aboard was, when you're at sea, you're going to work really hard and you're going to learn everything you can about the Navy. But when we're in port, you should go ashore and see as much of Japan as you possibly can. And so some of us went hiking through the Ainu Reservation on Hokkaido. We started, I guess, at Sasebo in the beginning, sailed up the China Sea, and really got to see a lot of Japan and a lot of sort of Asian geopolitics, which was fascinating. and I'd never been any place like that, like any of those places, and I found that fascinating. And then, my next time out of the country, I landed at Rhoda, Spain, on the way to join the Springfield. I was caught up with her at Naples, and I then spent the next year and a half, visiting all of these places that I'd heard about. And when we'd go on leave, I went up to Austria on one occasion. I flew up to Paris and then took a train from there down to Normandy and visited Normandy, and then flew over to. I did fly to London. And spent some time with the same cousin that I mentioned before. He was then at the London School of Economics getting an advanced degree. Um, and so I got to see, places in France and England that I'd never imagined I'd get to see, and do things I'd never imagined I'd get to do. And I think that had a lot to do with my sort of spurring my continued interest in history. Um,
No, that's
in law school,
no, that's
go ahead.
I appreciate your narrative, and I was wondering, going from math at Dartmouth to history to and how that came about. And I guess you talked too about your time at Harvard Law School. I was wondering, Professor Long, if you could, and I also, following Harvard Law School, you spent several decades in corporate law. We have a lot of members of the military community who are interested in pursuing a career in law. So if you have any tips for those individuals about some things that, obviously there are a lot of parts of your service experience that translate well to law school, in terms of your maturity level, in terms of handling stress. But if you could talk, maybe some tips to some budding law students about what they should look, some things that would help them in a possible law school or law career.
Sure, Eddie. This is unflattering to my wife describes me as a fully recovered lawyer, to my former colleagues. But the first, second, and third piece of advice I would give you is go to the best law school you can. If you have to mortgage your firstborn, go to the best law school you can, because lawyers are conservative in the nth degree. And I mean, if you look at the composition of the current Supreme Court, with the exception of the newest appointee, who was first in her class at Notre Dame, the rest of them all went to Harvard and Yale. And that's not the only place that happens. It happens in the private sector, and it happens in government jobs other than the Supreme Court, and firms. I mean, I did a lot of recruiting for Gibson Dunn, and then I spent a couple of years in the government as Deputy General Counsel for Policy on one of the banking agencies, and then was on the recruiting committee at Jones Day for a while too. And we would routinely recruit at the top 6 or 8, what we thought were the top 6 or 8 law schools. The U.S. News didn't have a ranking in those days, but it was Harvard, Yale, UVA, Columbia, Michigan, Stanford, Duke, and then we would also interview other people that seemed like good prospects. But if you went to one of those law schools, there were opportunities at every step of your career, not just when you got out and started a job, but if you wanted to switch and do something else partway through, or whatever. Lawyers are big followers of the pedigree, and I never met the lady, but you may all remember that several years ago, Harriet Myers was nominated to the Supreme Court by George Bush, and she was just railed as not being qualified. He then turned around and nominated John Roberts, who sailed through. Roberts went to Harvard. She went to SMU. SMU may be, a terrific law school. I've never had the privilege of working with people from there, but I don't think she got a fair chance, because people in the Congress and people elsewhere looked at her pedigree and said, "Well, I'm sorry, you're a nice lady, but no." And I think I think that is the case. The second thing, and today, the LSAT is critically important to which law schools you get into. Um, I had a student a few years back who got a 178 on his LSAT, and he had phone calls from Harvard and Yale the day after the score came out. Um, this year, 3 former Normandy students applying to schools, and they have scores in the 170s. And they're looking at that cut of law schools as well. A young cousin, one of my wife's blood cousins, from Iowa, and he was talking about, he went to Georgetown undergraduate, or part of it, I guess. He went to a school in the Middle West and then came back for a while. And he was thinking about going to the University of Iowa Law School because he wanted to go back to Iowa and practice. And I convinced Jeff that he ought to go. The only school around here he was really interested in was Georgetown. And this is long enough ago that Georgetown's law school was the best one in the district. And so Jeff did that, and he practiced here with a firm for a while, and then he went to Minneapolis and worked with one of the major firms there for a while, and then started his own white collar crime practice. But all of that was, and what I said to him was, you will have more options. The further up the pecking order, the law school you attend, the more options you're going to have as you move on from there. Second bit of advice is don't think that that just because you're interested in a field that's going to be what you want to do for the rest of your career in law. I started out planning to do international law. Surprise, surprise, given what I'd said about my Navy background. And Louis Loss wrote the book on corporate securities law. Literally, he wrote the 6-volume treatise on it. He taught securities law at Harvard Law School, but he was a bit of a pompous jerk. And the classrooms at Harvard had 150 seats in them. He would routinely subscribe 200 people for his classes because he liked to have people standing around the back for his lectures. And I thought that was crazy. And so in my third year, instead of taking his securities law class, I took a seminar on international business taught by Detlef, 6 people from the Harvard Business School, and we worked on international business problems. And it was fascinating. But I could spell securities, but that was about it when I got to Gibson. And I did international tax work for the first 2 or 3 years. Litigation and corporate tax in tax, because most of international law in those days was tax, and trying to find tax havens and that sort of thing. And then I did a litigation rotation, and then I decided that I really needed to get a good dose of corporate law if I was going to do advising corporate clients. And so I went to Bruce Gittleson, who was then the youngest partner at Gibson Dunn, who in his off time was teaching corporate securities at Stanford Law School. He'd fly up to Palo Alto twice a week and run his class and then come back and practice. And he and I started doing public offerings together. We got in his convertible to go off to the first all hands meeting for our first client meeting. And he said, "So what do you know about securities law?" And I said, "Nothing." And he said, "Well, let's start." Well, there's a statute called the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act separates investment banking from commercial banking. And we then went through the 33 Act and the 34 Act. And he basically taught me securities law, going to and from meetings, working on public offerings, and having me do the legwork for the offerings at the time. And I loved it. And I decided I would go back, and I decided I was going to do that for the rest of my career. And I did a lot of that. And in the course of doing offerings, I did several for savings and loan associations, which in those days were mostly mutual, meaning they were owned by the depositors. But there was a technique developed for them to convert from mutual to stock ownership. And I had done a lot of that, and I realized that the savings loan industry was in terrible trouble in 1978, 79. And I concluded that having having kind of picked them apart on behalf of either representing them as my client or representing an investment banker in doing an offering for them, that I understood a lot about the industry. And I concluded that it was in terrible trouble, and I thought I was smart enough to fix it. And so I was then offered a slot to be Deputy General Counsel for policy for the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, which was the group that regulated the savings loan industry on a national basis. And so I took that, and it turned out I was right about one of my two things. They were in terrible trouble. I was wrong about the other one. I wasn't smart enough to fix it. But it was. We did adopt a bunch of regulations about lending practices and that kind of stuff, which, had they remained in effect, and had they been applied to the commercial banking industry, would have either completely alleviated or would have mitigated dramatically the financial collapse of the 2007-2008. By then, they had been watered down, and banks and savings loans were doing all kinds of things that we wouldn't let them do in those days, in the interest of deregulation, and we had a financial collapse. And so I switched from doing public offerings and that kind of stuff to doing a lot of bank regulatory work when I left the bank board and went back into practice. And that turned out to sort of bring me back semi-full circle. One of the clients I represented was Abu Dhabi, the country. In the district, a national by the control of the currency. Did a batch of work for them and for other international clients. And so I'd sort of gone from international tax work to corporate securities, to mergers and acquisitions, to offerings, to bank regulation, and back to corporate securities, changing all the time. And I really loved all of the work I was doing. I found working for big firms to be ideal for what I wanted to do, because we got access to the most sophisticated legal problems there are. And I had no interest in doing sort of family law. The idea of divorce, being a divorce lawyer, was anathema to me. I can't imagine anything worse than trying to referee a family fight. And I still find it puzzling. I'm glad some people like to do that as a profession. I didn't want to. But being in the big firm, we got to have really fascinating clients. And we had the choice of personnel with whom we could work, and so if lawyer A was a jerk, I didn't have to work with that lawyer. I could work with lawyer B instead, and so I found that an ideal situation for my personality. That's about as different from the law practice that Abraham Lincoln had as you can imagine, where your clients were whoever walked in the door, and you did whatever came over the transom. But I found it fascinating. I really loved it, and so I would encourage you to not lock down what you're thinking about doing as part of your law practice, because it'll turn out to be different than you think it is from the outside looking in, and it'll be different than you think it is when you're in law school taking a class in the subject. And things are just different when you're on the ground than they are when you're studying them in an academic environment. And so be open-minded about the kind of work you want to do as a lawyer, and open-minded about how you want to go about it. I did not want to live in New York, and so being a corporate securities lawyer someplace other than New York was interesting. That largely controlled why we went to Los Angeles, because LA was the second or third biggest securities area in the country, and we enjoyed living in LA. And then Gibson needed somebody to be the kind of managing partner of the Washington office, and asked me to come back here, and so we moved to DC in '79 with Gibson, and then I went into the government for a couple of years, and then went to Jones Day afterwards. And so tips would be, go to the best law school you can. Don't lock yourself into an avenue of practice until you've had a chance to see it. It may be that it'll be exactly what you want to do and you'll do it for your whole career, but I predict that the odds are that you'll find other things that are peripheral that will attract you, and you'll be able to be flexible enough to adjust to those and adapt as you go forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor
Thank you so
Long, with
much,
those
Professor
tips on
Long, for
law.
those tips
Uh,
on law.
if I think the final
I
part of
think
our
the final part of
conversation
our
today, we'll have to
conversation
talk about
today, we'll have to
history,
talk about history,
your, I guess,
your,
third
I guess,
career
third career
in your life, and
in your life, and
if in particular, if you
in
talked
particular,
about
if you talk
some of your
about.
research, perhaps also Normandy. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. That's and my wife would say, "How long do you have?" Um, it's really easy to get me started on this. Yeah, I had always been fascinated in history and in naval history, particularly. With my family, we were on vacation, literally in Africa. My wife had always wanted to go see animals, and so we did a photo safari in Africa. And I took Ron Spector's book, Eagle Against the Sun, with me. And which is Ron's book about the war in the Pacific, and I love the book, and this was when I was a relatively young lawyer, but I was fascinated by that, and I guess I graduated from practice at the end of '98. I guess I had a pulmonary embolism in '95 and another one in '97, which had me in the hospital for a week. And my doctor at that point said, you really ought to spend less time on airplanes. At that point, I had 2 million frequent flyer miles on American Airlines because I was practicing here, and there aren't a whole lot of corporate offerings or opportunity here. So for practice, I was on an airplane all the time. And he said, you really shouldn't be flying as much as you are. And so that's when I decided maybe that was a good time to step down and go do history, which is what I'd always wanted to do and teach. And as luck would have it, the firm at that point had adopted an early retirement plan because Jones Day had been expanding very rapidly by acquiring other law firms, and in a particularly snobbish attitude, concluded that not everybody had the appropriate work ethic that we wanted within the firm, and so we should make it graceful for some of the partners in these firms to retire early, and so we did, and the numbers will all be wrong, but essentially, if you weren't bringing in 3 times as much money as you were taking out, all you had to do was hold up your hand and say, "I want to retire early," and you could retire on some fixed amount, say $75,000 a year, until you turn 65, and then you would go on regular retirement from the firm, stay on the firm's insurance policies and all that, but you could retire whenever you wanted. If you didn't meet their number test, you had to get permission from the management committee to retire. Well, having had the conversation with my doctor, and I went over and talked to Ron Spector about coming to GW and getting a PhD, and I flew over to Cleveland and I met with the managing partner and then the management committee. And I said, Pat, I want to retire. And I said, I'm going to use the early retirement program. And he said, you can't do that. You know why we set this up and you know how it works. And I said, yeah, but I can read. And it says, if I don't meet the numerical test, all I have to do is get the permission of the management committee. And I've had these 2 pulmonary emboli. And I think what I want to do is stop doing this now and get a PhD and teach history. And we talked for an entire morning, and they finally said okay. And so I was able to retire and stay on the firm's health insurance. And so I'm not on GW's health insurance program. I'm on the Jones Day retirement program, health insurance. And I talked to Ron, and you'd asked me also to mention about possibly a career in academia. I called Spector and told him I was thinking about this, and he said, I said I'm thinking about retiring from, and I want to get a PhD and teach history. And there was a long pause, and Ron then said, well, let me understand. Now, you said retire, so I'm guessing you're at least mid-50s. I was 58. Are you Caucasian? And I said, yes. And he said, and I'm guessing by your name and your voice that you're male. And I said, yes. And he said, and you think you can get a job teaching? What are you smoking? I want to get some of that. There are no jobs. And this was in 1998. He said, if you're really serious about this, come over and we can talk about it. And so I went over to his office. And at that point, Ron was chairman of the history department. And I told him I'd loved his book and that I was really interested in naval history. When I walked into his office, he had a fancy rug just inside the door with a Marine Corps emblem on it. And I looked at it and I said, "Are you a Marine?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he looked at me as though I'd hit him in the head with a 2x4. And we talked about it. And he said, I must have 30 calls a month from people who get aggravated with their boss, who say they want to get a job teaching and want to come do history, and they think it's going to be a vacation. Well, it's not. And so usually the speech I gave you, you're the first one actually that's ever come to see me. And so we talked about it, and so I took the GRE and came to GW and started in the fall of 99. I retired December 98. Studied French all summer because I needed another language. I had Russian and I wanted. And I started doing research. We'd had a small sailboat on the Chesapeake, and I was fascinated with the Chesapeake and its role in the American Revolution. And so I'd started doing research about the Virginia Navy during the American Revolution and about the British Royal Navy in its operations in the Chesapeake during that period. And because Susan's family had been in London, we go to London whenever we have a chance. I had done a lot of research in their archives over there about the ships that had been here. And I decided I would write my dissertation about the Virginia Navy in the American Revolution. And
call from 800 service.
We can edit that out. Sorry about that. Anyway, Lil Finn was then the early American professor in our history department. She now is teaching at the University of Colorado and one of the Fulbright for history, won one of the major prizes for history last year. A terrific teacher. And because Ron wasn't really interested in anything that happened before 1900, I had Lil help me on the colonial American history and Ron on the naval history, and did naval history and legal history and early modern British history as my major fields, and loved it. And they asked me, I started TAing as soon as I got here, and so I moved out of a corner office in the Jones Day office over in Metropolitan Square, the building that the Ebbett Grill is in. My office was in the corner of the 8th floor there. Dean Griswold, who had sent me that note about applying to law school, was then a partner of mine. He was in the diagonal corner opposite mine on that floor. I really right away moved out of the corner office and into one of the carrels in the TA suite, which is really good for the humility. That sort of pops any illusions that you have about being a big shot. But we've now been married 53 years, said, this isn't going to be as much fun as you think it is. The kids today are going to be on Facebook. They're going to be doing all kinds of stuff on their laptop instead of coming to class. And they're just not going to be as diligent as they were when we were in school in the 60s. And for once in 53 years, she was wrong. She was just wrong. And it has been every bit as much fun as I thought it would be. Andy said, I teach a 2-semester military history course 1 year. That's this year. So we start with the Battle of Megiddo in 1479 BC in the fall, and we finish somewhere this side of Vietnam in the spring. Next year, I'll do a 2-semester naval history, and we kind of nod and wink at the Greeks and Romans and start with the Age of Sail in the fall and go through the Napoleonic period, and then come on in the second semester. But the class that Andy mentioned that has been more fun than I ever imagined it would be is called The Price of Freedom, Normandy 1944. And it was really triggered by a man named Albert Small. Small was a real estate developer. He's 95 years old now. In the district, and a Navy veteran from the Second World War, served on a Cleveland, the USS Cleveland, a cruiser in the Pacific, and was talking to a friend of his named Bob Perry, who was then a trustee of GW, about it. And he said, "Bob, The kids today just don't get it. Freedom isn't free. It takes sacrifice. Said, I think what I want to do is charter a 747, and we'll fly 300 or 400 high school kids to France and take them out to Normandy, and they can see what sacrifice is all about. And Bob thought about it, and he did some checking around, and in essence concluded there are not enough border collies in the Western world to turn 400 American high school kids loose on the beach in France. Maybe what we should do is teach them about it first, and then take a smaller number and their teachers. And so we set up the Albert H. Small Normandy Institute, which now has an office on our floor. And for the first 3 years, I was the academic director, and we picked 15 high school students and 15 high school teachers from around the country. And Mr. Small would pay for a set of books, and we'd send them the books in December. And then starting in January, we did online lessons with them. And this was in 2011. And then we bring them to campus for a week in June, and then we go to France and we do what the Army would call a staff ride of the Normandy campaign. The first time I'd been to Normandy twice before, but I did a staff ride in 2010 with 12 West Point cadets, because one of my graduate students was a major in the Army. And after he did his coursework on his PhD here, his next duty station was to teach history at West Point. And he got up there and called and said, West Point does a staff ride of the Normandy campaign every year for 12 cadets. It's not paid for by the government. It's paid for by private donations. But I'm in charge of it next year. Do you want to go along? Yeah, Casey, I think I could try to fit that in. And so I went with them, and it was wonderful. He and his wife and the head of the military history department had spent 2 weeks using Army reports and identifying locations in France that are not on the everyday tour. And that became the staff ride. And so for the Institute, we picked up a new assignment. And we asked each student to find a soldier from his or her hometown who died in the Normandy campaign and who's buried in the Normandy American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach, and to write a biography of that soldier. They do other projects as well. And then I did that institute for 3 years, and then I stopped doing it because I got upset with some of the people that were working on it with us. I'd invite Casey to come down from West Point and give a lecture when we were here in June, and they wouldn't say thank you or kiss my foot or offer to reimburse him for his expenses or anything. And I decided I didn't need that, and so I'd stopped doing it. And I started teaching the GW class then in 2013. And it's the same model, except people work extraordinarily hard. The normal history class meets for 2 hours a week. We meet for 6 or 8. Tuesday we have an hour and a quarter lecture. Thursday we do the lecture, then an hour of discussion, and then we watch a movie and talk about it. So the first week we watched clips from Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, which is the Nazi propaganda movie, and we watched one of the 7 short films that Frank Capra produced called Why We Fight. War Department during the war. Talk about week we watch the first 2 episodes of Band of Brothers, and we talk about leadership, and so on. We do that, and then over spring break we fly to France, and the students have found a soldier and written a biography. And normally on Wednesday we go down to Omaha Beach, and I try to do it when we're there early in the morning because the tide goes down 18 feet in that stretch of France, and because the beach gradient is so shallow in that area, the tide goes out a quarter of a mile, goes out 400 yards. And that's what it was like when they landed. They landed just after low tide. That area has not been developed. And so you can walk out on that sand, and it sends chills up your spine to imagine what went on there. Anybody who's ever watched the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan has seen a dramatization of it. It's not a documentary. That's fictionalized. But what he was portraying there was the experience of a group of young men from Able Company, the 116th Infantry Regiment, part of the 29th Division. Able Company was made up of a Virginia National Guard unit. There were 30 kids in that unit from the town of Bedford, Virginia, or right around Bedford. Most of them joined because they wanted the extra $1 a week during the Depression to help tide their family over, that they got from being in the reserves. they landed on that stretch of Omaha Beach on the morning of the 6th of June, and by noon, 19 of the 30 kids from that town were dead on that beach. So what he shows in Private Ryan is a dramatization, but it's a good portrayal of what actually transpired there. We start there and we work our way down the beach to Colville Draw, and then go up into the cemetery, and we lay a wreath, and the personnel play taps and the Star Spangled Banner on the carillon. And then we go through the cemetery, and each one of the students presents a eulogy for their soldier standing at their soldier's graveside. And it is enormously powerful. By that time, this 20-year-old thinks that they grew up next door to a guy who died 75 years ago, and they become part of their life forever. And it's Mr. Small was right. It was the best possible way to communicate the message that freedom isn't free and requires commitment and sacrifice. And we've now had 112 students in that class. And if you walked into any one of them and said, "What's your soldier's name?" they could tell you in a heartbeat. Even if 2013 fits, they would know immediately. If you bumped into Johnny Stiff, he would say his name is Arthur Gump. He was from Las Vegas, New Mexico, and so that class has turned out to be something very special for me. This is probably the last year I'm going to teach it. I've told people that, and I think Eric Arneson is going to take it over and teach it next year, and then he and Denver Brunsman are going to take turns doing it every other year, which is probably smart.
You're leaving the class in very good hands.
I'm leaving the class in wonderful hands. Both Eric and Denver have been involved with it for several years, and they're both really committed to the idea behind the class, and so I feel very good about that. It's weird because I'm already older than I thought I would ever be when I was still teaching, and I feel just fine. And so I'm a little reticent about giving it up because I love it so much. But if I don't, they're going to find something else they want to do instead, and I will lose my two really good replacements. So it will be a much better course for having had some new blood put into it by those two people. Anyway, that's
Professor Long.
That's my history story.
Thank you, and we've covered some great turf. Any last words of wisdom for members of the military community as we're wrapping up this speaker series?
No, not really. Just that you should be extraordinarily proud of what you've done and what you've been able to accomplish. You should realize the habits you've developed and the things you've learned about responsibility and about sense of duty and team players, and those things are going to stand you in really good stead, regardless of what field you go into from here. You're going to find that you'll have memories from your military service days come back at the strangest times. Things will cause that to set off a bell, and that will bring back a memory, and you'll find that you're drawing on skills and attitudes and abilities that you developed when you were a young person in the military, and you'll find it paying dividends for the rest of your life. But thank you all very much for your service, for what you've done for this country, and for what you will do in the future.
Many thanks, Professor. Best wishes to you and your family. Thank you,
Andy. Thank you very much. Thank you for doing this series, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family as well.
Thanks a lot, Professor Long.